June 1944. A German soldier stands in an American prison camp kitchen holding a ladle. An armed guard sits at a table, fork in hand. The soldier serves the food. The guard eats first. Only then do the other prisoners eat. This happened every single day, 3 times a day for nearly 2 years. This is the true story of how enemies learn to trust each other, one meal at a time. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber never imagined his war would end in a kitchen in Louisiana. When his Afrika Korps unit surrendered to British forces in Tunisia in May 1943, he expected brutality, starvation, perhaps execution. Nazi propaganda had painted vivid pictures of Allied savagery, of prisoners tortured and starved in violation of every civilized norm. Instead, Weber found himself on a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, fed twice daily with rations that exceeded what German civilians were receiving back home. The journey took 3 weeks. Weber spent most of it below deck with hundreds of other captured Wehrmacht soldiers, sailors, and Luftwaffe personnel. They were a cross-section of Hitler's military machine, from hardened veterans of the Eastern Front to young conscripts who had barely fired their weapons. Weber himself was 28 years old, a baker's son from a small town outside Munich who had been drafted in 1941. His culinary training had made him valuable to his unit, and he had spent most of the North African campaign managing field kitchens rather than manning machine guns. When the ship docked in New York Harbor in June 1944, Weber got his first glimpse of America. The city's skyline rose impossibly high against the summer sky, untouched by bombs, gleaming with prosperity. The contrast with war-torn Europe was staggering. As the prisoners were marched down the gangplank under armed guard, Weber noticed something else. The American soldiers weren't beating them. They weren't screaming or threatening. They were simply processing them, efficiently and without apparent malice. At Fort Dix in New Jersey, the prisoners underwent medical examinations, delousing, and documentation. An American officer, speaking through a German-speaking translator, explained their rights under the Geneva Convention of 1929. They would be housed, fed, and clothed according to international law. They would be allowed to send and receive mail. They would be assigned work details, for which they would receive small wages in camp scrip. They would not be tortured or executed. Weber listened with skepticism, born of years of Nazi indoctrination. But the first meal at Fort Dix began to crack his disbelief. The mess hall served beef stew with fresh bread, vegetables, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory mixture that had become standard in Germany. The portions were generous, the quality good. Weber ate slowly, savoring flavors he had almost forgotten. Around him, other prisoners did the same, their faces reflecting the same confusion and cautious relief. If this was American brutality, it was unlike anything they had been told to expect. 3 days later, Weber and several hundred other prisoners boarded a train heading south. The journey took 2 days, passing through landscapes that seemed almost surreal in their abundance. Farms stretched across rolling hills, apparently untouched by war. Towns and cities showed no signs of bombing. People went about their lives as if the greatest conflict in human history wasn't consuming the rest of the world. For Weber, who had left a Germany already showing signs of deprivation and destruction, the contrast was profound. The train arrived at Camp Ruston in northern Louisiana on a sweltering June afternoon. The camp had been constructed in 1943 on land that had previously been pine forest. It sprawled across hundreds of acres, surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire and overlooked by guard towers. Inside the perimeter, rows of wooden barracks stood in neat lines, along with mess halls, recreation buildings, a hospital, and various administrative structures. The camp was designed to hold 4,000 prisoners, and by the time Weber arrived, it was nearly at capacity. During orientation, an American captain explained the camp rules through an interpreter. The prisoners would be organized into companies and assigned to barracks. They would maintain military discipline within their own ranks, with German officers retaining authority over enlisted men. They would be assigned work details, both within the camp and potentially at nearby farms and facilities facing labor shortages due to the war. They would receive the same rations as American soldiers, prepared according to Geneva Convention standards, and they would be expected to maintain order and cooperation. Then came the detail that would define Weber's experience for the next 2 years. The captain explained that prisoners with relevant skills would be assigned to specialized work details. Cooks, bakers, carpenters, electricians, and other tradesmen would be utilized according to their abilities. Weber's background as a trained baker and military cook made him an obvious candidate for kitchen duty. 2 days after his arrival, Weber was summoned to the camp's main kitchen facility. The building was larger than any field kitchen he had worked in during his military service, equipped with industrial stoves, ovens, refrigeration units, and storage areas stocked with ingredients that would have been luxuries in wartime Germany. An American mess sergeant stood waiting, a stocky man in his mid-30s with the weathered face of someone who had spent years working outdoors. Staff Sergeant James Morrison had been running military kitchens since before the war. He had grown up on a farm in Iowa, learned to cook from his mother, and joined the Army in 1938 when farm foreclosures made civilian life untenable. He had no particular hatred for Germans, no personal stake in the ideological conflict. He was a practical man tasked with feeding thousands of people efficiently and safely, and he needed skilled help to do it. Morrison looked Weber up and down, then spoke in slow, clear English. The interpreter translated. "Did Weber have kitchen experience?" "Yes," Weber replied. He had been a baker before the war and had managed field kitchens for his unit in North Africa. Morrison nodded. "Good." Weber would be assigned to the kitchen crew along with several other German cooks and bakers. They would prepare meals for the entire camp, both prisoners and guards under American supervision. Then Morrison explained the protocol that would govern every meal for the duration of Weber's imprisonment. The German cooks would prepare the food using ingredients provided by the U.S. Army. When each meal was ready, samples from every pot, every tray, every batch would be served first to the American guards. The guards would eat. Only after the guards had eaten, proving the food was safe, would the prisoners be allowed to eat the same food from the same pots. Weber understood immediately. The Americans were concerned about poisoning, about sabotage. It was a reasonable fear. He was, after all, an enemy soldier. The war was still raging. D-Day had just occurred weeks earlier. American boys were dying fighting Weber's countrymen. Why should the Americans trust German prisoners not to poison their food? But the elegance of the solution struck Weber as distinctly American in its practicality. Rather than having Americans cook all the food, which would be inefficient and waste the skills of trained German cooks, and rather than simply trusting the prisoners not to commit sabotage, which would be naive, the Americans had created a system of mutual assurance. The guards would eat first, proving the food was safe. If the food was poisoned, the guards would die before the prisoners. Therefore, the prisoners had every incentive to ensure the food was safe. It was a system based not on trust but on shared risk, and it was remarkably effective. Weber was assigned to work alongside 2 other German cooks. Feldwebel Ernst Becker was a career soldier in his 40s, who had been a professional baker in Hamburg before the war. He was precise, disciplined, and initially resentful of having to cook for his captors. Gefreiter Hans Müller was younger, barely 22, a farm boy from the Rhineland who had worked in his family's restaurant before being drafted. He was more adaptable, more willing to accept the strange circumstances they found themselves in. The 3 Germans, along with several other prisoners assigned to kitchen duties, began work the next morning at 5 a.m. Morrison supervised, demonstrating the equipment, explaining the menu requirements, and making clear his expectations. The food would be prepared to high standards. Portions would be consistent. Sanitation would be maintained. Any deviation from these standards would result in removal from kitchen duty and reassignment to less desirable work details. For the first meal, Morrison had planned a simple breakfast: scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, oatmeal, and coffee. The ingredients were already laid out when the German crew arrived. Weber cracked eggs into enormous bowls while Müller sliced bread and Becker prepared the oatmeal. The quantities were staggering. They were cooking for over 4,000 people, and the ingredient quality was better than what Weber had seen in German military kitchens even before the war had turned against them. When the food was ready, Morrison called over several guards. They sat at a table in the kitchen, and Weber served them samples from each pot: scrambled eggs from the first batch, bacon from the trays, toast from the first racks, oatmeal from the large kettles. The guards ate methodically without ceremony. Morrison watched them, then nodded to Weber. The food was approved. The prisoners could be fed. This ritual repeated 3 times a day, every day. Breakfast at 6 a.m., lunch at noon, dinner at 6 p.m. The German cooks prepared the meals. The American guards ate first, and then the prisoners received the same food. Over the following weeks, the routine became normalized. Weber and his fellow cooks arrived before dawn, prepared breakfast, watched the guards eat, then served the prisoners. They cleaned the kitchen, prepared lunch, repeated the ritual. They prepared dinner, repeated the ritual again. Day after day, week after week, the pattern held. Something unexpected began to happen. Weber took professional pride in his work. He had been trained as a baker, had spent years perfecting his craft. Even in captivity, even cooking for his captors, he couldn't bring himself to prepare mediocre food. He began experimenting within the constraints of the available ingredients and the American menu requirements. He improved the bread, making it lighter and more flavorful. He suggested modifications to the meal preparations that Morrison, after initial skepticism, approved. Becker, the older baker, was slower to adapt. He resented the situation, resented having to cook for Americans while German soldiers were still fighting and dying in Europe. But even he couldn't resist the pull of professional standards. When the bread wasn't perfect, it bothered him. When the pastries for Sunday meals weren't up to his standards, he insisted on redoing them. Morrison noticed and appreciated the dedication. Müller, the youngest, adapted most quickly. He was curious about American cooking methods, about the ingredients they used, about the differences between German and American cuisine. He asked questions through the interpreter, and Morrison, somewhat surprised, answered them. How did Americans make biscuits? Why did they use so much sugar? What was the purpose of certain spices Weber had never encountered? As summer turned to fall, the relationship between the German cooks and the American kitchen staff evolved from pure supervision to something more collaborative. Morrison began asking the Germans about their own culinary traditions. Could they make German bread? Could they prepare dishes from their homeland? The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive adequate nutrition, but it didn't specify that the food had to be exclusively American. Morrison proposed an experiment. For Sunday dinner, the German cooks could prepare a traditional German meal, provided they used only the ingredients available in the camp stores, and provided the guards ate first as always. Weber, Becker, and Müller consulted and planned. They settled on sauerbraten with red cabbage and spätzle. It wasn't exactly like home, the ingredients weren't quite right, but they could approximate it. The preparation took most of Saturday and Sunday. The beef had to marinate, the cabbage had to be prepared properly, the spätzle had to be made by hand. Morrison watched with interest as the Germans worked with an intensity they hadn't shown for routine American meals. When Sunday dinner was ready, the guards ate first, as always. Morrison took a bite of the sauerbraten, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded. It was good. Different from anything he had eaten before, but good. The German prisoners were served the same meal. For many of them, it was the first taste of home they had experienced in years. Some of the older prisoners wept quietly as they ate. The food wasn't just nutrition, it was memory, identity, a connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant and uncertain. After that, Morrison allowed the German cooks to occasionally prepare traditional dishes, always under supervision, always with the guards eating first. The Americans tried schnitzel, bratwurst, Stollen at Christmas. In return, the Germans learned to make American dishes: cornbread, biscuits, apple pie, fried chicken. The kitchen became a space of cultural exchange, mediated by food and governed by the ritual of shared meals. The psychological impact of this daily ritual was profound. Every meal reinforced the same message: we all eat the same. The guards ate first, not because their food was better, but to prove it was safe. Once they had eaten, the prisoners received identical portions from identical pots. There was no separate, inferior food for the captives. There was no deliberate deprivation or humiliation. There was simply food, prepared by Germans, tested by Americans, and shared by all. Weber found himself in an increasingly complex emotional position. He was still a German soldier. His country was still at war. His comrades were still fighting and dying. Yet here he was, cooking meals for American guards, watching them eat first to prove the food was safe, then feeding German prisoners the same food. The absurdity of it was matched only by its fundamental decency. Morrison, for his part, began to see the German cooks as individuals rather than as enemy soldiers. He learned that Weber had been a baker, that he had a wife and young daughter back in Bavaria, that he had been drafted and had never been particularly enthusiastic about Nazi ideology. He learned that Becker had owned a successful bakery in Hamburg before the war, that he was a master craftsman who took immense pride in his work. He learned that Müller was homesick, barely more than a boy, caught up in events far beyond his control. Conversations began, halting at first, conducted through interpreters or in broken English and German. Morrison showed Weber photographs of his family's farm in Iowa. Weber talked about his bakery, about the recipes his father had taught him, about his hopes of returning home after the war. They discovered common ground. Both were craftsmen, both valued quality work, both had been shaped by the Depression and by agricultural life. November 1944 brought Thanksgiving, a holiday Weber had never heard of before arriving in America. Morrison explained the tradition, a day of gratitude, of family gathering, of abundant food. The camp commander ordered a special Thanksgiving meal for everyone in the camp, guards and prisoners alike. Morrison assigned the German cooks to help prepare a traditional American feast: roasted turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. The preparation was enormous. Dozens of turkeys had to be roasted, hundreds of pounds of potatoes had to be mashed, countless pies had to be baked. Weber and his crew worked for 2 days straight, and for the first time, Morrison allowed them significant creative input. Becker prepared the pies using techniques from his bakery in Hamburg. Müller developed a stuffing recipe that combined American and German elements. Weber oversaw the turkey roasting with the precision of a military operation. On Thanksgiving Day, the ritual played out as always. The guards ate first, sampling from every dish. Morrison took a bite of turkey, a spoonful of stuffing, a taste of pie. He nodded his approval. The food was served to the prisoners. That evening, Weber sat in the mess hall with hundreds of other German prisoners, eating an American Thanksgiving dinner prepared by German hands and approved by American guards. The symbolism was not lost on him. Here they were, enemies in a global war, sitting down to a shared meal of gratitude. The guards had eaten first, as always, proving the food was safe. But once that ritual was complete, everyone ate the same turkey, the same stuffing, the same pie. Weber realized something that evening that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The daily ritual of guards eating first wasn't just about preventing poisoning. It was about establishing a fundamental equality. Yes, the Germans were prisoners. Yes, they were behind barbed wire under armed guard. But when it came to food, when it came to the most basic human need, they were treated the same as their captors. The guards ate first to prove safety, but then everyone ate the same food. There was no hierarchy of nutrition, no deliberate deprivation, no petty cruelty. This was not what Weber had been told to expect. Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies, and especially the Americans, as barbaric, as cruel, as contemptuous of civilized norms. Yet here was Weber, a captured enemy soldier, eating better food than German civilians were receiving back home, prepared in clean kitchens with abundant ingredients, under a system that ensured fairness through shared risk rather than through trust or naivety. Winter came to Louisiana, mild by German standards, but cold enough to require heating in the barracks. The kitchen work continued without interruption. Weber and his crew had now been preparing meals for 6 months, 3 times a day, every day. The ritual had become so routine that it required no thought. Prepare the food, serve the guards, wait for approval, serve the prisoners. The system worked because it was based on a simple, verifiable principle. Shared risk creates shared incentive. In January 1945, a Red Cross inspection team visited Camp Ruston. The International Committee of the Red Cross was responsible for monitoring compliance with the Geneva Convention, and they conducted regular inspections of POW camps on all sides of the conflict. The inspectors examined every aspect of camp operations: housing, medical care, mail service, recreation facilities, and food service. The kitchen inspection was thorough. The Red Cross representatives examined the storage facilities, the preparation areas, the sanitation procedures. They interviewed the German cooks through interpreters, asking about working conditions, ingredient quality, and portion sizes. They observed the meal preparation and the ritual of guards eating first. In their report, the inspectors noted the guards eat first protocol as an exemplary safety measure that protected both prisoners and guards while ensuring equal treatment. The system demonstrated that the United States was not only complying with the Geneva Convention's requirements for prisoner nutrition, but was exceeding them. The food quality was high, the portions were adequate, and the protocol ensured that prisoners received exactly the same food as their captors. Camp Rustin received a commendation for its treatment of prisoners. The report was filed with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva and became part of the official record of American POW camp operations during World War II. For Morrison and his kitchen crew, both American and German, it was validation that their system worked. But in March 1945, an incident tested the system in a way that no inspection could. After lunch service one day, several prisoners and 2 guards fell ill with severe stomach cramps and vomiting. The camp medical staff responded immediately, treating the affected individuals and launching an investigation. The kitchen was quarantined, and Weber and his crew were placed under guard while the incident was investigated. The implications were serious. If the food had been deliberately poisoned, it would be a violation of the implicit trust that had developed over months of shared meals. It would justify the worst suspicions about German prisoners. It could result in criminal charges, possibly even execution for those responsible. Weber and his crew were terrified, knowing they were innocent, but uncertain whether they could prove it. The investigation was methodical. The camp medical officer examined the victims, analyzed their symptoms, and traced their movements throughout the day. He inspected the kitchen, examining every ingredient, every storage container, every preparation surface. He interviewed the German cooks, the American supervisors, and the guards who had eaten first. The conclusion came after 2 days of investigation. The illness had been caused by dairy products that had been improperly stored and had begun to spoil. It was food poisoning, not deliberate poisoning. It was an accident, a failure of refrigeration, not sabotage. And critically, the guards who had eaten first had also become ill, proving that the guards eat first protocol had worked exactly as intended. If the food had been deliberately poisoned, the guards would have been the first victims, and the prisoners would never have been served. Morrison personally informed Weber of the investigation's findings. Through an interpreter, he explained that no one was being charged with any crime, that the incident had been an accident, and that kitchen operations would resume the next day with improved storage protocols. He also said something else, something that surprised Weber. Morrison thanked the German cooks for their consistent professionalism, said that he had never believed they were responsible for deliberate poisoning, and expressed confidence in their continued work. Weber was stunned. He had expected punishment, perhaps removal from kitchen duty, possibly worse. Instead, he received understanding and continued trust. The incident, rather than destroying the relationship between the German cooks and American supervisors, had actually strengthened it. The system had been tested and had proven its worth. The guards had eaten first, had gotten sick along with some prisoners, and the investigation had cleared the German cooks of any wrongdoing. Kitchen operations resumed with renewed attention to food safety. Additional refrigeration was installed, storage protocols were tightened, and inspection procedures were enhanced. But the fundamental ritual remained unchanged. The German cooks prepared the food, the American guards ate first, and then the prisoners received the same food from the same pots. The system had survived its greatest test. April 1945 brought news that shook the camp to its core. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, they began liberating Nazi concentration camps. The reports were horrific beyond comprehension. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, millions murdered in industrial killing operations, starvation, medical experiments, gas chambers, mass graves. The full scope of Nazi atrocities was being revealed to the world. The news reached Camp Rustin through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official briefings. The American guards learned what their country had been fighting against. The German prisoners learned what their country had done in their name. The psychological impact was devastating. Weber had known that Jews were being persecuted. He had known about deportations, about restrictions, about violence. But he had not known about the camps, about the systematic murder, about the industrial scale of the killing. Like many ordinary Germans, he had been kept ignorant of the full truth, had believed the propaganda about resettlement and labor camps. Now the truth was undeniable, documented in photographs and testimony that could not be dismissed as Allied propaganda. The revelation created a crisis of conscience for many German prisoners. They had fought for a regime that had committed crimes beyond imagination. They had served a cause that had resulted in genocide. They had been, however unwittingly, part of a system that had murdered millions of innocent people. In the kitchen, the work continued, but the atmosphere was heavy with shame and confusion. Weber prepared meals mechanically, his mind struggling to process what he had learned. Becker, the older baker, became withdrawn and silent. Miller, the youngest, openly wept while kneading bread. Morrison could have used this moment to exact revenge, to humiliate the German prisoners, to make them pay for the crimes of their regime. The American guards would have been justified in their anger, in their contempt, in their desire for retribution. But Morrison did neither. He maintained the same professional standards, the same protocols, the same treatment. One morning, as Weber was preparing breakfast, Morrison approached him. Through an interpreter, he said something that Weber would never forget. "You're not responsible for what Hitler did. You're responsible for what you do here. And here you've done good work." It was a simple statement, but it carried profound meaning. Morrison was drawing a distinction between the German prisoners as individuals and the Nazi regime they had served. He was acknowledging that Weber and his fellow cooks were not personally responsible for the Holocaust, even as they had to confront the reality of what their country had done. And he was affirming that their behavior in the camp, their professionalism, their cooperation, their humanity, mattered. The meals continued. The ritual continued. The guards ate first, proving the food was safe. The prisoners ate the same food. 3 times a day, every day, the system reinforced the same message. Despite everything, despite the war, despite the atrocities, despite the justified anger and grief, there was still a baseline of human decency that could be maintained. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In Camp Rustin, the news was met with mixed emotions. The American guards celebrated, relieved that the fighting was finally finished, hopeful that they might soon return home. The German prisoners felt relief that the killing had stopped, but also grief for their defeated country, uncertainty about their future, and shame over what Germany had become. Weber stood in the kitchen that evening, preparing dinner as he had done every day for nearly a year. The routine was the same, the ingredients were the same, the protocol was the same, but everything had changed. He was no longer a prisoner of war in the traditional sense. Germany had surrendered. There was no more German military to return to, no more war to fight. He was simply a German man in an American camp, cooking meals and waiting to learn what would happen next. The surrender raised immediate questions about repatriation. When would the prisoners be sent home? What would they return to? Germany was in ruins, occupied by Allied forces, its cities destroyed, its economy collapsed, its government dissolved. Many prisoners had no idea whether their families were alive, whether their homes still existed, whether there was anything to return to. The U.S. government faced a practical problem. Repatriating hundreds of thousands of German prisoners would be a massive logistical undertaking, and there was no urgency to do so. Germany was occupied and devastated. The prisoners were not a security threat, and many of them possessed skills that were valuable in an America still facing labor shortages despite the war's end. In the summer of 1945, the U.S. government announced a voluntary program. German prisoners who wished to remain in the United States temporarily, as civilian contract workers could do so. They would no longer be POWs but would be voluntary workers, paid wages, allowed greater freedom of movement, and permitted to work in civilian jobs. Eventually they would be repatriated, but the timeline was flexible. Weber faced a choice. He could request immediate repatriation, returning to a Bavaria that was now occupied by American forces, where his bakery had likely been destroyed, where food was scarce and the future uncertain. Or he could volunteer to stay in Louisiana, continue working in the camp kitchen or potentially in civilian employment, earn money, and wait for Germany to stabilize before returning. It was not an easy decision. Weber desperately wanted to see his wife and daughter, to know if they had survived the war, to reunite his family. But he also recognized that returning immediately to a devastated Germany might not be the best choice. If he could stay in America, earn money, and send it home, he might be able to help his family more than if he returned penniless to a country with no functioning economy. After much deliberation, Weber volunteered to stay. So did Becker and Muller. So did thousands of other German prisoners across the United States. The transition from POW to voluntary worker was gradual. The barbed wire remained, the guards remained, but the legal status changed. The men were no longer prisoners but contract workers, still living in the camp but now receiving wages for their labor. The kitchen work continued, but the dynamics shifted subtly. Weber and his crew were no longer cooking as prisoners under guard, but as employees under supervision. The distinction might have seemed minor, but it was psychologically significant. They were choosing to be there, choosing to work, choosing to cooperate. And the ritual of guards eating first, while still maintained for practical reasons, took on a different meaning. It was no longer about preventing prisoner sabotage, but about maintaining a safety protocol in a communal kitchen. Morrison began training Weber and the other German cooks in American kitchen management practices, not as prisoners learning to follow orders, but as professionals learning new skills. He shared recipes, techniques, and organizational methods. He talked about the possibility of the Germans eventually working in civilian kitchens, in restaurants, in bakeries. In the fall of 1945, local businesses in Ruston and surrounding areas began hiring German workers. The labor shortage caused by the war had not immediately resolved with the war's end, and the German prisoners, now voluntary workers, represented a skilled and available workforce. Weber was offered a position at a restaurant in Ruston, working as a baker and cook. He accepted. The transition to civilian work was strange. Weber still lived in the camp, still returned there each evening, but during the day he worked in a civilian kitchen alongside American employees. He was paid a wage, not camp scrip but actual money. He was treated as an employee, not a prisoner. He interacted with American civilians, not just guards and fellow prisoners. The restaurant owner, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson, had initially been skeptical about hiring a German. Her son was serving in the Pacific and she had no particular fondness for the enemy. But she needed a skilled baker, and Weber's credentials were solid. She gave him a trial period, watching him carefully, ready to dismiss him at the first sign of trouble. Weber worked with the same professionalism he had shown in the camp kitchen. He arrived early, prepared high-quality baked goods, maintained cleanliness, and cooperated with the other staff. Mrs. Patterson's skepticism gradually faded. After a month, she told Weber that he could stay as long as he wanted. After 2 months, she increased his wages. After 3 months, she told him that when he eventually returned to Germany, he would be welcome to come back to America if he ever wanted to. December 1945 marked 18 months since Weber had arrived at Camp Ruston. The camp population was declining as prisoners were gradually repatriated. Some men had already returned to Germany. Others, like Weber, were still working as voluntary laborers, waiting for the right time to go home. The camp that had once held over 4,000 prisoners now housed fewer than 2,000. Morrison organized a farewell dinner for a group of prisoners who were scheduled to depart in January. He asked Weber, Becker, and Müller to prepare a special meal, combining American and German dishes, a final shared meal before the men went their separate ways. The German cooks agreed, and they planned an elaborate menu. Roasted chicken with both American and German preparations, multiple side dishes, fresh bread, and an array of desserts. The preparation took 2 days. Weber baked bread using techniques his father had taught him. Becker prepared pastries that would have been at home in his Hamburg bakery. Müller created side dishes that blended American ingredients with German methods. Morrison supervised, but his role had evolved from guard to colleague, from supervisor to partner. On the evening of the dinner, the mess hall was arranged differently than usual. Instead of the typical cafeteria-style service, tables were set with proper place settings. Guards and prisoners would eat together at the same tables at the same time. The ritual of guards eating first would be observed one final time, but then everyone would sit together for the meal. Morrison called the guards forward. They took samples from each dish, tasted them, and nodded approval. The food was safe. But then, instead of the prisoners being served separately, Morrison invited everyone to sit. Guards and prisoners, Americans and Germans, former enemies and current colleagues, sat at the same tables. Weber served the food, moving from table to table with platters and bowls. He placed chicken on the plates of American guards and German prisoners alike. He offered bread to men who had once been his captors and to men who had once been his comrades. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. Morrison stood and gave a brief speech. He thanked the German cooks for 18 months of professional work, for their cooperation, for their skill. He acknowledged the strangeness of the situation, enemies cooking for each other, sharing meals, developing mutual respect. He expressed hope that the men returning to Germany would find their families safe and would help rebuild their country into something better than what it had been. Then Morrison did something unexpected. He asked Weber to respond. Weber, surprised and uncertain, stood. His English had improved over 18 months, but he still struggled with complex expressions. Through a combination of broken English and translated German, he spoke. He thanked Morrison and the American guards for treating the German prisoners with fairness and dignity. He acknowledged that the prisoners had expected brutality and had instead received decency. He talked about the daily ritual of guards eating first, how it had seemed strange at first but had come to represent something important, a system based not on trust, but on shared risk, not on naivety, but on practical fairness. Weber said that he had learned something important during his time at Camp Rustin. He had learned that civilization was not about ideology or propaganda or national superiority. Civilization was about how you treated people, especially people you had every reason to hate. The Americans had every reason to hate the Germans after learning about the concentration camps, after losing soldiers in battle, after years of war. But they had maintained their standards, had followed their principles, had treated their prisoners according to the rules they claimed to believe in. Weber concluded by saying that when he returned to Germany, he would tell people about his experience. He would tell them that the Americans had proven that democracy was not just propaganda, that their values were not just words. He would tell them about the guards who ate first, proving the food was safe, and then shared that same food with their prisoners. He would tell them that there was a better way to organize society, a way based on fairness and dignity rather than on domination and cruelty. The meal that followed was unlike any that had been served in Camp Rustin before. Guards and prisoners sat together, talking, sharing stories, acknowledging the strangeness and significance of the moment. They were still separated by language, by culture, by recent history, but for that evening they were simply people sharing a meal, recognizing their common humanity. Weber returned to Germany in March 1947, nearly 3 years after his capture in North Africa. The repatriation process had been slow, delayed by logistical challenges and by the chaos of post-war Europe. When he finally boarded the ship in New York Harbor, he carried with him money he had earned working in America, letters of recommendation from Morrison and Mrs. Patterson, and memories that would shape the rest of his life. Bavaria was as devastated as he had feared. His hometown had been bombed, his family's bakery destroyed, but his wife and daughter had survived, living with relatives in a village that had been spared the worst of the destruction. The reunion was emotional and complicated. Weber had been gone for 4 years. His daughter, who had been 3 when he was drafted, was now 7 and barely remembered him. His wife had endured years of hardship, uncertainty, and fear. They had to rebuild not just their business, but their family. Weber used the money he had earned in America to begin rebuilding the bakery. It took years. Germany's economy was shattered, resources were scarce, and the occupation created its own challenges. But Weber had learned skills in America, had developed connections, and had a work ethic that had been reinforced by his time in Camp Rustin. By 1950, the bakery was operational again. By 1955, it was thriving. Weber maintained correspondence with Morrison for decades. They exchanged letters several times a year, sharing news of their families, their work, their lives. Morrison eventually retired from the army and returned to his family's farm in Iowa. Weber's bakery became successful enough that he was able to expand and eventually pass it on to his daughter. The two men, former enemy and captor, became lifelong friends, connected by their shared experience in a prison camp kitchen in Louisiana. In 1985, Weber returned to Louisiana for the first time since his repatriation. He was 70 years old, retired, and wanted to see Camp Rustin one more time. The camp itself had been decommissioned after the war, and most of the buildings had been demolished. But a small museum had been established to commemorate the camp's history, and a reunion of former guards and prisoners had been organized. Morrison was there, now 76 years old, still living on his farm in Iowa but healthy enough to travel. The two men embraced. Old friends reunited after decades. They toured the museum together, looking at photographs of the camp, reading documents about its operations, remembering their time there. That evening, a dinner was held for the reunion attendees. Weber and Morrison sat together, along with several other former guards and prisoners. The meal was simple, nothing like the elaborate farewell dinner from 1945, but the symbolism was the same. Former enemies, now old men, sharing a meal and remembering a time when they had learned to see each other as human beings rather than as abstractions. During the dinner, someone asked Weber about his most significant memory from Camp Rustin. He thought for a moment, then answered. It was the daily ritual, he said. The guards eating first, 3 times a day, every day, for 18 months. At first it had seemed like just a security measure, a practical protocol to prevent poisoning. But over time, it had come to mean something more. The ritual had established a fundamental equality. Yes, the Germans were prisoners. Yes, they were behind barbed wire. Yes, they had lost the war. But when it came to food, when it came to the most basic human need, they were treated the same as their captors. The guards ate first to prove safety, but then everyone ate the same food from the same pots. There was no hierarchy of nutrition, no deliberate deprivation, no petty cruelty. Weber said that the ritual had taught him something about civilization. A civilized society was not defined by its treatment of friends and allies. It was defined by its treatment of enemies and prisoners. The Americans could have starved the German prisoners, could have fed them inferior food, could have used food as a weapon of humiliation and control. Instead, they had created a system that ensured fairness through shared risk. The guards ate first, putting themselves at risk, to prove that the prisoners would receive safe food. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented a profound commitment to principle over expedience. Morrison responded with his own reflection. He said that the guards eat first protocol had been practical, yes, but it had also been strategic. America was fighting a war not just against Nazi Germany, but against Nazi ideology. The Nazis claimed that democracy was weak, that humanitarian principles were naive. That might made right. By treating German prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, by maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies, America was proving that democracy was not weak but strong, that principles were not naive but practical, that civilization could be maintained even in wartime. The protocol had worked, Morrison said, because it was based on a simple truth. Shared risk creates shared incentive. The guards ate first, so the prisoners had every reason to ensure the food was safe. It was not based on trust, which would have been foolish, but on mutual self-interest, which was reliable. And over time, that system of mutual self-interest had evolved into something more: mutual respect, and eventually, mutual friendship. The conversation continued late into the evening. Other former guards and prisoners shared their memories, their reflections on what Camp Rustin had meant, how it had shaped their understanding of war, peace, and human nature. There was acknowledgement of the strangeness of it all, of the fact that they had been enemies and were now friends, of the long journey from suspicion to trust. As the evening ended, Weber and Morrison stood together outside the building where the dinner had been held. It was a warm Louisiana night, similar to many nights Weber remembered from his time in the camp. Morrison asked Weber if he had any regrets about his time as a prisoner. Weber thought carefully before answering. He said that he regretted the war, regretted the suffering it had caused, regretted what Germany had done under Nazi rule, but he did not regret his time at Camp Rustin. It had been a strange education, a lesson in how enemies could treat each other with dignity, how systems could be designed to ensure fairness, how civilization could be maintained even in the midst of conflict. Morrison nodded. He said that he felt the same. The war had been necessary. The defeat of Nazi Germany had been essential, but the treatment of prisoners had been equally important. It had been a demonstration that America's values were not just propaganda, that democracy could maintain its principles even under pressure, that civilization was not just about winning, but about how you won. Weber returned to Germany the next week, and he and Morrison continued their correspondence until Morrison's death in 1993. Weber lived until 1998, dying at the age of 83. In his final years, he often told the story of Camp Rustin to his grandchildren, emphasizing the lesson he had learned, that civilization was measured not by how you treated friends, but by how you treated enemies. The historical record of Camp Rustin and the broader American POW camp system during World War II supports Weber's experience. Over 425,000 German prisoners were held in more than 500 camps across 46 states. The mortality rate among German POWs in American custody was approximately 0.15%, one of the lowest in history, and a stark contrast to the 27% mortality rate among Soviet POWs in German custody. This difference was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate policy decision by the United States to comply strictly with the Geneva Convention, both because it was the right thing to do and because it served strategic purposes. Treating prisoners well encouraged surrender, demonstrated the superiority of democratic values, and provided moral authority in the post-war period. The Guards Eat First protocol, while not universal across all camps, was documented in multiple locations, including Camp Rustin. It represented a practical solution to a real security concern, but it also embodied a broader principle, that fairness could be maintained through systems that aligned incentives rather than through naive trust or through cruelty. The protocol worked because it was based on shared risk. The guards put themselves at risk by eating first, demonstrating that they were not trying to poison the prisoners. The prisoners had every incentive to prepare safe food, because the guards would be the first to suffer if the food was contaminated. This alignment of incentives created a stable system that could function even in the absence of trust. Over time, the system did more than just prevent poisoning. It established a daily ritual that reinforced equality and dignity. 3 times a day, every day, the same message was communicated: we all eat the same. The guards ate first to prove safety, but then everyone received identical food from identical pots. There was no hierarchy of nutrition, no deliberate deprivation, no use of food as a weapon of control. This daily ritual had psychological effects that extended far beyond mere nutrition. It humanized both guards and prisoners to each other. The guards saw the prisoners as skilled workers, as professionals, as individuals with families and histories. The prisoners saw the guards as fair supervisors, as men doing their jobs without unnecessary cruelty, as representatives of a system that maintained its principles even toward enemies. The kitchen became a space where enemies could interact as colleagues. Language barriers were overcome through the universal language of cooking. Cultural differences were bridged through shared meals. Professional respect developed between German cooks and American supervisors. And the daily ritual of guards eating first became not just a security measure, but a symbol of a broader commitment to fairness and dignity. The legacy of Camp Rustin and similar facilities extends beyond the immediate post-war period. The treatment of German POWs in American custody became a model for future conflicts, demonstrating that maintaining civilized standards toward prisoners was both morally right and strategically effective. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened in 1949, partly based on lessons learned from World War II, and the principle that prisoners must be treated humanely became more firmly established in international law. The story of German cooks in American POW camps also contributed to post-war reconciliation between Germany and the United States. Former prisoners returned to Germany with stories of fair treatment, of adequate food, of dignity maintained even in captivity. These stories helped counter Soviet propaganda about American brutality and contributed to West Germany's alignment with the Western Alliance during the Cold War. On an individual level, the experience shaped the lives of thousands of men on both sides. German prisoners like Weber learned that democracy was not just propaganda, that American values were not just words, that civilization could be maintained even toward enemies. American guards like Morrison learned that enemy soldiers were individuals, that Germans were not all Nazis, that humanity could be found even in those who had fought for an evil cause. The Guards Eat First protocol stands as a small but significant example of how systems can be designed to ensure fairness through aligned incentives, rather than through trust or cruelty. It was a practical solution to a real problem, but it also embodied a principle, that civilization is maintained through consistent application of standards, that fairness can be achieved through smart design, and that even enemies can be treated with dignity. In the end, the story of Camp Rustin and its kitchen is a story about choices. The United States could have chosen to treat German prisoners cruelly, could have used food as a weapon, could have abandoned civilized standards in response to Nazi atrocities. Instead, America chose to maintain its principles, to follow the Geneva Convention, to treat prisoners with dignity. That choice had costs, required resources, and demanded discipline, but it also had benefits. It encouraged surrender, demonstrated democratic values, provided moral authority, and contributed to post-war reconciliation. The daily ritual of guards eating first was a small part of that larger choice. 3 times a day, every day for years, American guards ate food prepared by German prisoners, proving it was safe, and then those same prisoners ate the same food. It was a simple system based on practical considerations, but it represented something profound: the commitment to maintain civilization even in the midst of war, to treat enemies with dignity even when they had not earned it, and to prove through actions that democratic values were not just propaganda, but principles worth fighting for. Weber understood this by the end of his life. His experience at Camp Rustin had taught him that civilization was not about ideology or national superiority. It was about systems, about standards, about the daily choices to treat people with dignity even when you had every reason not to. The guards who ate first, proving the food was safe, had demonstrated this principle 3 times a day for 18 months. And that lesson, learned in a prison camp kitchen in Louisiana, had shaped Weber's understanding of what it meant to be civilized for the rest of his life. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Hit that like button if you appreciate learning about how humanity can prevail even in the darkest times, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most about this story. Did you know about the treatment of German POWs in America during World War II? What other untold stories from history would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us bring more of these forgotten moments to light. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.